Biden has called for Vladimir Putin to be tried for war crimes. Moscow's ambassador to the UN has denied that the atrocities were carried out during the Russian occupation. The World Health Organization has warned that 99% of the world's population is breathing air that could threaten their health. And South Africa is lifting its state of disaster imposed 2 years ago to combat the spread of COVID-19.
Moira Alderson there. Moira, thank you very much. Now let's go to Sri Lanka. Hundreds of thousands of people across Sri Lanka have been protesting. The voices raised against a deepening economic crisis. Shortages in fuel, in food, in medicines. Police have faced off demonstrators with tear gas in some cases as the crowds call for the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Our South Asia correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan sent us this report from Colombo.
In a country once deeply divided by a civil war, this is a moment of solidarity, uniting people from all backgrounds and communities, young and old, rich and poor. Protesters are angry at the government, who they blame for mismanaging this crisis.
There's no petrol, there's no diesel, kids can't sit their exams because there's no paper, and there's no power for 12 hours a day. How much worse do you want it to get?
People can't afford their next meal. That is the saddest and the most dire state that any country could get to.
They have robbed everything from us. They have robbed the basic rights of the people. We don't have electricity for 17 long hours. No medicine, hospitals are closed because we don't have medicine.
But the Prime Minister and President, brothers Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, are still in charge, despite growing calls for them to step aside. This crisis stemmed from a shortage of foreign exchange, partly due to a drop in tourism during the pandemic. But others also blamed the economic policies of the Rajapaksas. And as food and fuel remain in short supply, many say the only way things will get better is if they go.
BBC's Rajini Vaidyanathan there. So let's delve a little bit more deeply into the reasons behind the crisis. The economic situation has been brewing really for several years, as our South Asia editor Ambarasan Ethirajan explains.
Many Sri Lankan politicians, they realized that this economic tsunami was coming. In fact, a few years ago, I was talking with one of the senior advisors of the previous president. He said, we are in for a major economic trouble because we have to repay so much amount, first of all, to our international companies and debtors. And then we are also talking about, having enough money for import. So it was not that they were not aware of this crisis. They were very clearly, aware of what was going on, what kind of economic situation they were getting into. But then the escalation of one by one, in the last 6 months, you see the dollar prices going up, imports being curtailed, food prices going up, cooking gas cylinders almost doubled, milk powder prices, which is one of the essentials, almost trebled, and people are not getting enough goods from many shops, and many of these small eateries have been shut down, which is really hitting people hard. And that's why, you see this kind of anger. And then instead of solving these issues, and people see the soldiers on the streets, and that triggers, more anger, what the government is doing to solve this economic crisis.
The BBC's Ambarasan Ethirajan. There have, though, been ways out of this situation, but the government really has ignored them. This is according to Dr. Paiki Soti Saravanamutu, who is founder and executive director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives. He says the country really should have asked for help many months ago.
The gross mismanagement of this government in terms of spending much more than we earn, reducing the tax base to the extent that the exchequer has lost about 500 to 600 billion rupees, foolhardily assuming that we can move to organic fertilizer overnight, disrupting the food chain. Then in addition to that, of course, we've had the external shocks of the COVID pandemic as well as the war in Ukraine. But the particular intensity of this crisis is because this government has decided that it would pay international sovereign bond holders rather than save our foreign exchange reserves to import the basic essentials for our people. We should have gone to the IMF quite some time ago. Because if we went to the IMF sort of is like an international sanitary inspector in that it would have allowed us to access more bilateral and multilateral finance, and most importantly, also have access to finance in the international markets, which is now completely closed to us.
That's Dr. Paika Soti-Saravanamutu there from the Director Centre for Policy Alternatives. There's a lot to unpick here, a lot of reasons why things have gone so badly wrong. There's been climate change has played a part. There's been a drought which has put a great hole into their ability to get hydroelectric power. There's the Ukraine crisis which has stopped Russian tourists, for instance, from coming to Sri Lanka. A lot of things. Are there some particular lessons we should take away from this, particularly about things like inflation, perhaps, and about how crises can really hit countries like this, poorer countries, very hard, very quickly?
I think the latter. One of the things that really concerns me about climate change and the remedies, whether you ignore the problem or you go with the remedies, it's going to radically change, for example, where people go to vacation. You know, we talk about going from industrial agriculture to small farms. You know, do New Yorkers start getting in their car and going to the Catskill Mountains again instead of flying to exotic places? That uses a lot less energy, especially if you have an electric car. I think that places like Sri Lanka are going to suffer from that. Places that rely on one thing, whether it's extracting oil, whether it's tourism, whether it's selling sugar, what have you, these crises tend to change where people go, what they buy, and so forth. And small countries don't adjust very well. Because of that, because they become globalized, they've forgotten how to do things for themselves. They buy their food from abroad and so forth. And the real problem with climate change is not Sri Lanka, but many Sri Lankans at the same time. The IMF can't bail out the whole world all at once. What's more, inside of countries like the United States, whole regions are going to suffer from drought. We already have that in the West, and a lot of resources will be tapped off that way, so they won't be so inclined to help.
Okay, Yoko, I think it's really interesting, these ideas about globalization or end of globalization or the problems with globalization, but also there must be, following on from what Peter was saying there, the importance of globalization to be able to help countries like this out. I mean, we really are in a sort of bind here, aren't we, about which way we're going in terms of sort of global policy on trade, on business.
Sure, and I think the globalization needs to go on or to be accelerated more because we're essentially talking about the whole world, and we can't just let the smaller nations to go under or whatever. And so in that sense, I think we really continue to do that. And yet, I mean, take an example of Japan. Japan has closed the borders for such a long time. And when I did the tourism in Southeast Asia, I mean, that's their industry. And I mean, including Sri Lanka and so forth. But we've closed the borders. And so that really has affected a lot of smaller countries. And I myself are not able to go out for 2 years, over 2 years, and I think finally I'm able to get out soon.
Here's a real critical question, Jamie. If you go to these alternative technologies to deal with climate change and so forth, can a place like Sri Lanka support the population it has?
Okay, I'm gonna have
tourism.
Sorry, the music is about to come up, and we're about to go to a break. Peter, going to be back in just a second. I'm going to ask you to repeat that question, but just in a few minutes after we've had the news.